Good evening. I was amazed when I talked to a microphone and I can actually hear it booming out through the room. I don't know why I had some morbid thought that all mechanical items fail around. Anyway, I am Andrea Lerner Thompson, City Councilor for the City of Jacksonville. It's my great privilege to welcome you all here this evening for session 2 of our planning code development updates. One little order of business, I'd like to ask everyone to silence their cell phone. Those tend to be distracting. I'm not going to take the time tonight to introduce members of the CCI and the CAC who actually are working to bring you tonight's meeting, but we have a very full slate of issues, so we're just going to dispense with that. But most of them are walking around with these cute white tags on, so if you see one, you can stop a person. I want to very quickly mention and promote a program tomorrow night, same place, 6 o'clock, the Jacksonville Wildfire Comprehensive Wildfire Protection Project. More about that tomorrow, but I will say briefly, Jacksonville has received approximately $1.5 million for use in and around Jacksonville for fuel reduction. That money will be available for municipal and private landowner use to try to make our community safer for wildfire. If you possibly can, come to our meeting here tomorrow at 6 o'clock. If you can't make it, if you have questions, send me an email to my city council website. I'll be glad to put you in connection with the program. Thank you. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our planning director, Ian Foster.
Thank you, Councilor Thompson, and thank you all for coming to the second series of our first series of town hall events. Yeah, sorry. So this is the second of a three-part series of town hall events to kind of introduce the public to our process so far, and to give you kind of give you the update as to the changes that the CAC is recommending to date so far. There will be more town hall events following this, so this is again the first or the second of 3 of a series of many more. So we will have more updates as we move along in the process, but we just wanted to kind of bring everyone up to speed about what the CAC has been up to as far as the updates to the Jacksonville Development Code. So tonight we will take some time to highlight some of the proposed changes to the Development Code, but more pressingly, this session will focus on some requirements that have come forward from the state of Oregon. So we had kind of a set of topics tonight that will still be in place tonight, but the first one on that agenda item on parking will probably take up a lot of our time this evening. So just to kind of give everyone that warning up front, there are some new guidelines, well, I shouldn't say guidelines, some new requirements coming down to the state level that are requiring us to amend our parking standards. So we are going to be spending more time on parking, taking probably more questions from the public on that, and we may have to defer some of our other topics. I don't know if was anyone here specifically here for manufactured housing as a specific topic. Okay, so that's good. That was on our agenda items for tonight, so we may defer that to another night because this parking reform will probably take them. So we'll get more into the details of that as we go along. But in the meantime, just as a reminder to folks, you can submit comments to us at any time during this process. And the way you do that, you can submit comments tonight if you'd like through we have a box back there for anyone who wants to write a comment down. You can email your planning department at any time with comments about this process. You can attend the CAC meeting at any point. You can speak at those meetings. We have a period of time at the beginning of the meeting where we invite the public to speak. And or you can personally come visit me at any time if you want to talk more about the code revision process. I'd be happy to talk to any of you about the process to date so far. But before we begin with our focus areas for tonight, I just also want to point out our website, JacksonvilleCodeUpdate.com. You can visit that site and find a lot lot of resources on there. We're updating it now pretty regularly, and you can actually find a video link to our last town hall on that website. So if you missed it, or if you had problems see, I know this isn't the ideal situation with the TV completely back there, but we have a video link that shows our presentation and with our slideshow. So if you missed that meeting, or if you want to share that meeting, it's available on our website. We also have links to documents from tonight's presentation. We have tonight's presentation on our website. So I can quickly just kind of show where that is if you would like. Yikes. Yeah, that's a hazard. Okay, so on our development code website, which you can access by hitting that QR code too, if you find it. There we go. So this is the website that has all of the information about this project. It's kind of has a lot of resources on there, as I said. But if you go to the the little tab up here and go to the Learn and Ask section, you can find all the resources from tonight's town hall meeting. So you can find links to the maps, you can find historic character unit charts, and you can find our presentation from this evening. And then if you go to the Engage Jacksonville tab, you can find our video presentation from the October 19th town hall and watch it if you'd like and catch up on it. So that resource is there for all of you. James, could you get the slide? Okay, so before we get into our focus areas for tonight, there was a suggestion to advance to the next slide. Just as some context for the group, there was a request to kind of provide a zoning map to the public, so you just have some context about what we're talking about with some of the areas that we're presenting some of this work. So the zoning map provides the basic information on permitted uses within any area or neighborhood within the city of Jacksonville. So the center area is the downtown California corridor area. That's the historic core zoning district. And then you have our residential zoning districts all around there as well. So that provides some context for what would be implemented with some of these changes. So that just as just to kind of provide you with some simple guidance as far as the neighborhoods and areas that some of these codes may be affected. Okay, so now on to our slide 3, which is our focus areas for tonight. So we'll go over parking, neighborhood character units, fences, solar standards, and signs. But for the purpose of our meeting tonight, and based on some particular urgency with some state required parking reform, we will spend a big chunk of that time on parking. I'll also dedicate some time to the neighborhood character units, because it's also a pretty important topic. So as far as parking, if you could go to slide 4, please. So as I said, we were kind of prepared to take this in a completely different direction tonight as far as parking. We had worked through our tables to determine our minimum parking requirements for development in the city of Jacksonville. But then we got some interesting directives from the state that we are required to comply with. So Dan Shireman, our contract planner from Rhode Island Council of Governments, has put together an overview of those required changes that we will go over here in just a moment. But as some background on this, what I mean as far as minimum parking requirements. So when a developer or when there's a change in use of a specific site and someone comes forward, our tool has traditionally been to require a specific number of on-site parking spaces or a type of development. So if you were proposing a new office building in Jacksonville, we would say, okay, based on your square footage, we will require so many parking spaces provided on site for that. That's the traditional tool to accommodate for on-site parking. Or if you're building a new single-family dwelling, we require 2 on-site parking spaces for a new single-family dwelling. I will tell you that this requirement kind of upends all of that. So it's pretty significant change. But I will also say this doesn't affect the way we regulate our right-of-way parking requirements. So it has nothing to do with how the city regulates the use of parking on right-of-ways and things like that. So, you know, the way we regulate timing on parking spaces, our own specific permitting requirements on parking, that's not affected. It's really the private parking requirements on specific developments. So with that, I think I will turn it over to James to give some additional information on the. Watch your step.
Right. So, good evening, everyone. Hi. Howdy. So my name is James Shireman. As you can tell, we're giving degrees to the spelling on these days. I'm a lifelong resident of the Rogue Valley. I grew up at Seven Oaks Farm down at Central Point. I have the honor of speaking to you here tonight about these state reforms related to parking requirements, specifically to cities within metropolitan areas. We'll look into that further. And man, this is just such a real experience. I'm honored here to speak for all of you tonight, and I admire you all for your sense of civic pride. And you've really given this town a lot of character and a lot of heart. And so I thank you all. So without further ado, we'll get into it.
I think I don't know what happened to the mouse. It must have fallen away when I tripped.
It's in front of you there.
Is it? Oh, okay.
Take it.
You want me to go back?
I can go back, unfortunately. I should be able to go forward. Okay, so parking reform. We'll be specifically looking at Oregon Administrative Rules 430 and 440. These are both found in DLCD's section of the OARs, which is section 660, and division 12 is the transportation planning rules. These are rules that the Department of Land Conservation and Development, DLCD, drafts to help better regulate land use planning throughout the state of Oregon. So tonight we'll be looking at OARs 430 through 440, but really the rules encompass rules 400 through 450. But in my opinion, it's 430 and 440 that have the most immediate deadlines that drastically affect small communities. So the reason behind the reform. As I said before, these rules were drafted by the Department of Land Conservation and Development. And they're primarily related to combating rising emissions in the state of Oregon. Currently, the state is not slated to meet their emission goals because individual car ownership is becoming ever popular. And that relates to the sort of incentivized cycle of car ownership, whereby a community, by requiring parking to be provided with a development, owning a car becomes very attractive to traveling to that development. Personal car ownership increases strains on roads, and therefore developments are located farther away, meaning that more parking needs to be provided so that people can travel farther. You can see that it's just a continual feedback loop. So ULCD is hoping to end that loop and drastically reform how parking is controlled within these cities. The third component is there's a lot of those invisible costs associated with requiring such an amount of parking within cities. For example, the maintenance of parking lots, and furthermore, the restriction of buildings to maximize their footprint by being required to put down so many parking spaces. An office could be a lot bigger if they only required a few parking spots for employees and then had a van or carpool option in their parking lot. And furthermore, it's impossible for metered parking to compete with free parking when it's so readily available. So that denies cities a source of revenue. And so therefore, those are simply invisible costs associated with parking. So these rules 400 through 450, they apply to cities within metropolitan areas, which behind me will be it's pretty much any urbanized area you can think of in Oregon. There's a formal definition that relates to cities of a certain population that are in close proximity with one another. And they're officially dubbed metropolitan planning organizations, but you can really just think of them as metropolitan areas. Portland Metro being one of the largest, the Salem Kaiser being the Salem Kaiser MPO being sizable as well. You can also see at the bottom there, the Middle Road and Road Valley MPOs, and Jacksonville happens to fall within the Road Valley MPO, which is that southern and easternmost pink block there, the Salem map. So to give a general timeline of how these reforms will impact our code update, DLCP is requiring that these rules be implemented by January 1st. That doesn't necessarily mean our code needs to be updated to reflect these changes, but starting January 1st, any applications that come into the city hall will need to be allowed to use these OARs to maximize the lesser parking requirements. It's a view of planning staff, however, that we amend our code as soon as possible to reflect that requirement. It would be frustrating for developers to come in and hear a different thing and see a different thing. So this is why overall, these required reforms will result in part of the code being updated before the comprehensive update is complete. We'll need to complete the section related to parking and other sections that the CAC finds as satisfactory and update those first before moving on to the comprehensive update of the whole. And there are further reforms required by June 30th, 2023. We very well may decide to roll all of those in. There are some multiple avenues for reform approaches. And so it really depends on what the public and CAC finds. Okay, so getting into it, 430, rule 1. What essentially OAR 660-012-430 states is that a city can only mandate a 1-to-1 ratio of parking spaces for dwelling units, so long as there's more than one dwelling unit present on a single legally established property. So if you have a single family home and, well, I guess we won't use ADU because there's exceptions for ADUs. If you have a duplex, the minimum amount of parking the city can require is 2 spaces. A triplex, 3 spaces, a cottage court with 4 cottages, 4, a multifamily apartment style development, however many units are present on site, that's how many minimum parking spaces you can require. So this means that municipal codes can no longer have provisions, including things like guest spaces for every amount of units that you have, or you can't have unfair ratios of requiring 2 spaces or 3 spaces for duplexes. Really a 1-to-1 ratio to units to spaces. There's another requirement that eliminates requirements for residential uses if they are single room occupancies or if the dwelling is under 750 square feet. And as I said before, that strongly relates to ADUs, tiny homes, where essentially the city can't require parking of a development if it constitutes a single room or is under 750 square feet. So, for example, if you were to have a duplex and have an ADU in the back lot, the minimum number of parking you require is 2, so long as that duplex is under 750 square feet. Now, you may be hearing minimum as that is the most parking that will ever be on site, and really that's sort of a misnomer. Parking minimum could be viewed as synonymous to market-driven parking, where it's up to the developer to decide how much parking is appropriate for the type of development. A developer could go in and say, I don't want to put 2 spaces down for a duplex. I want to put down 4 because families own lots of cars and they're going to have guests over sometimes. But really what it does is remove control from the city mandating these parking minimums and trust developers to decide what amount of parking is appropriate. And being market driven, it could very well result in swings of little parking being developed and then developers seeking to provide private parking areas to fund a lack of parking in the city. So There's another requirement that eliminates parking minimums for another type of land uses, those being shelters too. What can we go back one? Okay. Those being assisted living facilities or care homes or transitional housing or shelters for domestic violence. So for those types of land uses, cities will no longer be allowed to require any parking of them. The minimum parking requirements are 0. So again, it would be up to a developer to decide what amount of parking is appropriate for that type of use. So that's 430. Moving on to 440. 440 relates to parking minimums in proximity to frequent transit corridors. And you can see up there, 3 cities and counties may not enforce parking mandate for developments on a lot or parcel that includes lands within 1/2 mile of frequent transit corridors, including, and really what cities should be most concerned with is definition C. As definition C states, that corridors with the most frequent transit routes or routes in the community, the scheduled frequency is at least once per hour. You'll see that definition B states that the parking the transit service must occur 4 times within an hour, but C accounts for communities that have a lack of transit and instead just uses the most frequent route provided it occurs once an hour. You guys know Jacksonville, RVTD serves through Jacksonville, and that bus comes once an hour. And so looking back at the previous caveat, of 440, you'll see that we can no longer mandate parking within 1/2 mile of that transit corridor that goes through Jacksonville. That's what that transit corridor looks like. So you can see that these reforms that are being expedited to be introduced and regulated within cities really remove a lot of control over small towns that are only served by 1 transit corridor to control their parking minimums. And it's in presenting this presentation and this map to the CAC. We decided what next steps would be most appropriate. And really, when you evaluate the extent that Rule 440 covers the town of Jacksonville, the CAC viewed it appropriate that perhaps eliminating parking minimums citywide would best alleviate further reform. As by there's a route that you can go down where you eliminate parking minimums citywide, or you can apply all of the rest of these rules, including the transit corridors and further land uses, and it would really involve making the development code a lot more involved and having all sorts of loopholes and layers to consider in a development, whereas introducing the citywide removal of parking minimums would be a blanket resolution. It would create no sort of areas of exception. And when you look at, if we go back to the map again, if you look at what Rule 440 accomplishes, you'll see that really any of the areas not covered by their radius are the parcels that are most likely to introduce parking spaces for private assets. You'll see that that's a lot of single family neighborhoods. People are going to build homes with garages and spaces to park their own personal vehicles. So really the market driven aspect of this rule would not result in much change in those properties. But it really does is it removes control of the downtown areas and the commercial areas. So I understand that may be a hard pill to swallow. It is state reform after all, and it is definitely contentious. Some people believe that the definition of transit corridor may not be the most concise or precisely worded, and I'll be happy to answer any further questions at the end of this presentation.
We'll get through this presentation and then save plenty of time for questions at the end on that. Piece of marketing, because I think that's some pretty significant implications for Jacksonville. So the one thing about it is that Jacksonville right now in our historic code, it's kind of unique, is that we have a parking district where we actually don't require on-site parking within the downtown core area. So we're kind of ahead of the curve there, but this impacts everything beyond the historic core down the street corridor and to those outlying areas. So it does have the potential to have some impacts to our city for sure. So that's something that we can certainly have some Q&A on as we move forward in the evening. So, okay, so next up though, we're going to move on to the focus area of our neighborhood character units. And so we put the descriptions of a comprehensive description of the character units on our website for you to review. So we can kind of get some more information about what they do and what they say. And so I think to get some more context that's available to you on there. So what the purpose of the character units are for the city of Jacksonville, well, you all should have a map there in front of you. There are specific descriptions in the neighborhoods that provide context and overall description of the existing types of development in certain areas within the city of Jacksonville. So they're intended to highlight specific characters of various neighborhoods in Jacksonville. So I wanted to kind of go over how we currently apply them. And again, we'll probably get into we're going to get into the direction of where the CAC is going with this, and also tie into some additional state reform requirements as far as housing goes, as far as what we can and cannot apply in certain areas of the city. Okay, so the context for the historic character units comes from our comprehensive plan. So they are to implement contextual design review standards and require all new development to be compatible. That's kind of the key word with its neighborhood character unit. And they're intended to adopt a design review process which embraces and relies upon neighborhood character within decision. So the way we apply that is when someone comes into the city with a proposed development, say someone wants to build a new single family dwelling and they live on South 4th Street. So if there's a vacant lot there, they submit an application and they have to provide a finding to the city that describes how that development or that their design is compatible within the context of their neighborhood. So what they do is they refer to character unit descriptions within the comprehensive plan, and then they draft a finding about how their design fits in within the context of that neighborhood. And so I provided for you tonight kind of an example. It's the character unit description sheet, and it has kind of an overview of what those descriptions look like. So from the position of someone who's building a new house, or even if someone remodeling, these are kind of the context that you work from in order to develop that finding. So you would kind of look at a map, find where your lot is, and then look at that neighborhood context, and then design your proposal around that and try to fit it in within that character of that unit. That was the idea, that was the purpose behind the character units. And so when the park or the hearings body reviews the proposal, they use the criterion from chapter 18 of our development code, and that criterion states that a building, structure, or development shall conform to the character criteria of the historic character unit within which the subject property is located. Character criteria are those features which describe the neighborhood's own visual and physical composition. So that's an example of that sheet out there. That's again, if someone's bringing in a proposal to us, they would kind of design it to fit in within that character description. So the problem we are now facing, again, kind of comes from statewide requirements for housing review. So ORS 197.307037 and Senate Bill 1051. So the ORS requires clear and objective standards requiring the development of. So that means that you can't apply standards that are not clear and objective, meaning there are not specific standards for the type of design. So you have to be very specific in what you require. So you can say things like the new single family dwelling shall have a garage that's set back 20 feet from the water, 10 feet behind the front wall of the house. The house shall have this many openings on the front, it shall have a covered porch with some architectural design elements. You can't say that it shall be compatible with adjacent property. But there is, that's not a cover all, so there are some areas where you still can apply that, but broadly you cannot as far as housing. So there's some carve outs for that, specifically as it relates to historic protections in our historic core area. So I want to make that clear. So this doesn't necessarily apply everywhere, but it does affect our city. Okay, and then Senate Bill 1051 went beyond that, and that was passed in 2019, and that states that it includes all housing types. So before it was kind of specific for new housing units or needed housing, but now the cities have to have clear and objective standards for all housing types. So again, you have to have standards that are very specific and cannot have any subjective standards included with that. So we've had this actually very recently where we had a development where there was some concern about the compatibility of a dwelling in a contemporary neighborhood. And so we presented that to legal counsel saying, is this something that's at odds with this new requirement? And they said absolutely cannot impose standards that are not clear and objective in an area that's not historically protected or within a non-historic district. So they basically said you have to apply clear and objective standards and not use compatibility standards in that context. So the key point, except for those properties protected as historic resources or those that are adjacent to a historic resource, we need to basically, the CAC been charged with revising the ordinance to again have standards that are more clear and objective and remove those compatibility standards out of the land development code. Can't give you an answer for me. But just to kind of highlight some of the character unit descriptions, because one of the struggles that our architects have is that the character units themselves, when we receive an application, they didn't really tell us all that much anyway. So again, as I mentioned, that criterion that an applicant is supposed to present an application that addresses the character unit description. And then the HARC is supposed to make a finding, the Historic Commission is supposed to make a finding that the house is compatible based on the character unit description provided for those neighborhoods. So we took a couple of examples. So the historic core is definitely the most detailed character unit we have. So there are multiple pages that kind of go over the description of the historic core. And the historic core section and all of our historic protections will be reviewed later by our CAC. But as far as contemporary residential areas, I just want to highlight some of the neighborhood character unit description. So for North Oregon Street, the character unit description, one of them is there's no distinct style in the neighborhood. As far as South Oregon Street, it says no one particular type of style. New school district, most modern working in town. Old school district, not many high style structures. Third Street corridor, no underlying style or age. So when you're applying compatibility standards and you're sort of use this as your baseline, kind of come up with whether it's compatible or not, there's really a lot of holes that one could poke in it as to whether it really fits within those descriptions. So the CAC reviewed the neighborhood character units and they thought, well, these are really just, these don't really accomplish what I think the intent was originally with them. So, and based on the legislation, based on the rules, they felt it was necessary to focus more on individual lot development and to ensure that we have a robust development code that has those specific design standards built into it and not the ambiguous language of compatibility. Because again, if that was appealed at a city at a statewide level, because a lot of these decisions could be appealed, and they're basing it on a finding subject to that standard. You know, if someone presented a finding that they fit because the neighborhood character you're describing is not having a distinctive stylistic features, then the city, you know, it's going to be really hard to uphold that decision. So more importantly, the CSD determined it was best to develop a set of design standards that are very specific, community development patterns and things like that, that really address specific design standards as opposed to having those compatibility things. However, they wanted to focus in on historic sites and to those structures adjacent to historic and keep it focused on site by site basis. So kind of focusing in, narrowing in, if you're in a historic core or if you're in a historic resource or you're adjacent to a historic resource, then there are compatibilities, because it is important that a development on a specific site be compatible to whatever it could be affecting. So instead of like a broad look, you're looking at whatever you may be affecting historically within the specific context of a neighborhood. So instead of, you know, like on the 3rd Street corridor, you could build a house next to a historic bungalow that would not really fit in the context, but it would meet that standard. So instead, the direction is, well, you need to be compatible specifically with that, whatever you're affecting in the immediate vicinity of the historic resource. So again, it kind of makes it more specific and makes it more protective as far as the historic protection go. So in the historic core, we do have the neighborhood character unit would, you know, those descriptions will remain in the comprehensive plan. And then you could apply those standards within the historic core and making sure that whatever is happening to adjacent to historic resources or within that core are compatible within that district. And then if you're outside of the historic core and you happen to be adjacent to a historic resource, again, the importance of protecting that historic resource and making sure that you're built to a way that's compatible with that historic resource is the direction that the CAC thought was the best way to approach this. Because again, we don't have a lot to say as far as the requirements for, you know, clear objective standards. So, but we do have the ability to include more robust design elements into our code. So that's kind of the direction we're going, is less ambiguity and more direct. Okay. So James, we can go on to the next slide. Okay, so actually this is part of the changes the CAC recommended for fences. Really not all that different than what we currently have within the development code. The citizen advisory committee really discussed the process for new fences within the city of Jacksonville. Right now, we've had a pretty there's a big distinction between if you're a historic resource and you want to put in a new fence, or if you're adjacent to a historic resource, our department charges you $240, and you have to go through the full, you know, notice period and things like that. That's always seemed a little bit too onerous for property owners, that fee level for fences, because fences are pretty clear and objective in themselves. But we do, the CAC feels, of course, that on historic properties, you can still regulate. There's, you know, for a lot of properties, the materials of picket, wood fences and things like that. But the determination is that maybe that procedurally, we cut that back into more of a review that's less onerous on property owners, more equitable. Because if you're in some situations, you could have a property that's in the level 1 review area. And if you're wanting a new fence, will charge $240. You could be one house over and you'll have a $60 fee for that property to get a fence review. So trying to make it a little bit more evenly split as far as process goes, because fences are pretty clearly objective as far as what we require currently and what we're proposing as well. So there's really not significant changes proposed to the fence ordinance, other than to kind of make the procedure a little bit easier for folks. So again, we're not charging huge amounts for fence pieces, because right now there is no, there are no requirements that it's basically meet the height requirement, the material requirement, and that's big. And so that's kind of an easier process that we can check off on. They did add one piece where right now we don't have really anything in our code that allows for like a entry feature on the fence. So if you wanted to have like a little entry corridor on your fence, right now technically we don't really have anything that allows that in our development code. So we do have allowances for some of those architectural features built into the fence. And then we also have some additional height that you can do, particularly because of the deer problem in the rear yard. But it does require an additional step, an additional permit, but you can do it. But you, of course, you don't want large swaths of chain link and things like that. So there's the material requirements for it. And it does allow some additional height, so long as you have some clearance area that you can. It's not just solid. Annual fence, it does allow for additional height. Right now, our rear yard fence is actually 6 feet. I think everyone here probably has a deer problem, I'm guessing. So we can add a little bit more height to that standard. With the fence requirements. For sure.
What about the fire department and fences with locks? Is that going to go against them being able to get into the house in an emergency? If you have is that considered in the proposal code? If a fire department can't get into the house because that's got the lock.
Oh, like a gated house.
Yeah.
We didn't have anything specifically written in that, but the fire official has some say over those.
So does that mean that there has to be another permit from the fire department if you build a fence with a gate that they can enter the house, or does it mean that the city has to put that into the context of building the fence?
So that would probably fall to the fire official to kind of. There's not an actual permitting process, but they generally do need some access. So if it's just a front gate, it's one thing, but if it's an entry gate, driveway gate, that's a different thing. Do access, driveway access. Okay, I should. Sorry, I should have. We'll take questions at the end if that's okay. Okay, so now on to signs. Another interesting topic as far as what we have in our current code and what we need to change as far as the requirements that are coming down. This actually goes back to 2015 when the Supreme Court weighed in on what cities can and cannot regulate as far as sign ordinances. And so our code has a lot of currently has a lot of standards as far as what you can put into sign content wise. So we have language in there about not allowing any national branding and national logos in our sign code. In 2015, through the U.S. Supreme Court, the court said cities can no longer regulate content of signs of any kind. So we can regulate sign types. So what I mean by sign types, you can say, signs have to still be wood, signs or metal, we can regulate material, but size, we can regulate size of the sign, but anything on those signs, we have no control of. So we basically have to, if someone submits a sign to us, we're looking at the signage, what's on there. We've drafted a code to kind of reflect that. So again, to regulate the content, or excuse me, the actual sign types, which are consistent with our current code. So again, to kind of recognize the historic core is very specific type of sign that was in place there. So it's consistent with what's currently in the historic book as far as materials go, as far as lighting goes, because we have very good requirements as far as lighting. We require signs to have kind of subdued lighting on them. It's directed downward, or if it's pointed up, that it's not shining off property, things like that. But we did remove any reference to content, so we have to remain content neutral. So there are some things like we have, there's a provision in the current code that says that you can't have a sign for another business on another business's property. Well, that implies content, it's that language in and of itself. So we had to strike that kind of language out of the code. Another piece that comes up a lot is the way we describe it's kind of, you know, currently right now is the thing, the political sign. So we're changing it to reflect, instead of calling them political signs, because that again implies the content of the sign, we're calling it temporary signs that are placed in and around an election. It's kind of what we're doing. So it has, we can still regulate the time that people put up political signs, or temporary signs being around an election. So we have that window of time, and we can regulate those sizes of signs as well. So that's kind of the direction we've been going with this. Another key point that comes up a lot and recently as well are sandwich boards. So sandwich boards have kind of expanded. You know, there's no real no clear standards with them. There was some technically they were initially they weren't allowed, and then they were allowed, and then it just kind of got rolled out. So this code it's very specific in the standards for sandwich boards. So it limits them to one per business. So if you have a business, you can have one sandwich board within a certain distance, and it limits the size. And it also requires them to get a permit from us. So it does provide a little bit more of a check on it. And also because we need to maintain, make sure that our sidewalks and rights of way are cleared for access and wheelchair access and all that stuff. So we are including more requirements for those sandwich boards and permits for those sandwich boards, because there are some places that have expanded into 3 or 4 sandwich boards. So we're including some additional regulations on it. And then finally tonight, because I do want to save plenty of time for questions, I wanted to just touch on the solar standards. And then this is kind of a 2-part piece, because there are the solar panel standards, and there are specific standards as far as the solar shadow casting regulations that the city has within our development code. I'm going to focus right now primarily on the solar panel standards, touch on the solar shadow casting bit a little bit. But as far as the solar panel requirements, the Oregon State Building Code is now requiring every new single family dwelling to be stubbed as ready for solar energy access. So if we're issuing permits for a new single family dwelling in Jacksonville, they have to be solar ready. So that's again a requirement from the new statewide building code. Also, there are a lot of incentives right now for solar energy. And so right now, what our development code says is that if you're in a contemporary dwelling, solar panels should be placed on a non-visible side of the dwelling. It doesn't say shall, it says should, which is always a little bit big. So it's not as direct as it probably was intended to be. But there's a relief from standards that folks can apply for to get relief from that requirement. So the first 3 years that I started working in Jacksonville, I think we had 1 request, maybe 2 for solar panel installation. This past 2 years, it's been basically consuming the park's agendas. So we've had more interest in solar energy the past 2 years than the past, several combined. So we have had a lot of interest in this, and that's primarily due to incentives and push from the statewide building code to allow to make available solar energy on new single family dwellings. So what the CAC is recommending as far as the code amendment goes on that is that if you are in a non-historic contemporary dwelling, that it's acceptable and okay to have those solar panels on a front facing portion of a single family dwelling, because it's again kind of the direction that things are going. Not to say that they still did not give that okay to historic resources. So we went through kind of an exercise to see if we could put solar panels on this building and see if it was possible. And we submitted a proposal to the state historic preservation office, and they've been absolutely not on historic resource. So even though they wouldn't have really been visible, but it got shut down. So that's kind of the direction is they're historic. The solar panel piece doesn't necessarily fit, but on a contemporary dwelling, you're in a modern neighborhood with all of the direction that things are going, that there should be more allowances for solar panels. So that's the direction the CAC is recommending for this bill as far as solar energy devices go. And then as far as the solar setback requirement, that's a little more complicated. So I don't know if anyone has had any experience with our solar standards in the Jacksonville code. But if anyone is proposing a new addition or new structure of any kind within the city of Jacksonville, you're subject to an additional setback based on the solar shadow casting area. So the intent is to protect your neighbors to protect your right to collect solar energy on their property. So it's almost an odd with our solar ordinance that says the panel can only be placed on a very specific portion of the dwelling. We then have this solar ordinance that says that you have to protect the neighbor from having all the solar energy, sunlight access that you possibly have. So it's kind of an odd. The original CAC that went through this development code a year ago initially pulled that solar shadow casting language out of the draft development code altogether. The direction from the current CAC was that it does make sense to keep it in some way, but they want it in a way that makes sense because it is very complicated in the way it is right now. It's not user friendly and it's not easy to figure out. As planning staff, even we are not able to, verify. You broke the rule.
I did. I thought I had.
So that's good. As far as the determining grades and things like that, and where that shadow casting area has been, it's pretty complicated from a staffing perspective and from the applicant's perspective. So we're working on that model, which we hope to have finished here soon. It makes it a little bit more easy to figure out. And so if you're a property owner or a neighbor to someone that's developing, you can see easily what their solar envelope is. And so just to make it kind of a little bit clearer for that. So we're keeping that in the development code in some way, or that's the direction now anyway. So again, hope to have that figured out here soon. So with that, I want to reserve kind of the end of the meeting for questions. But again, I want to just reiterate that we're working diligently on having drafts of this, and we'll have additional town halls with drafts of this language, and we'll go over a lot of this stuff. So you can kind of see it and have a comment period on a lot of this again, so you can react to a lot of these changes again as well. But in the meantime, I'm happy to answer your questions, and James can answer your questions. The partner one too. That's I think we should circulate mics because we do have, a Zoom recording going, and we'd like to post this on the website so people can hear the questions as well. No one's on there, but we're recording it on Zoom, so.
Linda Graham, 1015 Beverly Way. So my question is, because I used to be on the parking committee, so this is my baby. I understand that this new parking requirements from the state will not affect our special permit parking system that we have, because that's only in the historic core. So that really should not be affected, if I'm correct. And secondly, if we are going to have a problem with parking per se for the outliers coming in town, have we discussed or are looking into contracts to do park and ride situations, say at various church parking lots or behind Windermere, things like that, where we can set up and be proactive for these very things that are going to be imposed upon us, so it will not hurt the downtown business core as much as it is perceived to possibly do.
So as far as the parking, district goes, so, what you're talking about, the parking, the permitting process, and all that, that's for.
Well, you have your special permit
The
parking
special permit parking, that will not be affected. That's.
and the businesses will still
Pay
pay
their
their
parking
parking
district.
district.
In
fees.
fact, one thing that we are discussing is expanding as a result of this, is the possibility of expanding that parking district to the general commercial zone.
But that's
So-
just paying into a fee system,
Fee-
not providing parking.
Yeah, so that's kind of the whole foundation of why people in the historic core don't have to provide on-site parking. Is the idea was that instead of in lieu of providing on-site parking, they would basically be assigned a certain number of what would be required spaces for the use. And they pay into a fee schedule or an annual fee, basically, to accommodate what they do. And so it's meant for the development of parking facilities off-site. Yeah. So the idea would be to possibly expand the parking district down the Fifth Street corridor to accommodate because of these new things.
But would those fees possibly be utilized to develop contracts with, say, church parking lots and such, to rent certain properties, say during business hours, during weekdays, for park and rides type thing? Being proactive,
Yeah,
just
well,
food for thought.
yeah, something that you probably have to be thinking about a lot of different
Right after.
options, you know. And I should say that there are some lawsuits happening in the background of all of this, not with us, but other cities are doing it.
No surprise there.
And so we'll see. Yeah. Right.
So, according to the new parking guidelines from the state, will our comprehensive plan have to be, the transportation section have to be revised prior to code revision? Because I know, I think it was 2009, the transportation section of the comprehensive plan was revised. And a lot of our code, our comprehensive plan is outdated by about 30 years. So, I'm just wondering, how will that affect the comprehensive plan? And moving forward with some of these changes, because I thought the comp plan was supposed to kind of guide the development plans.
Yeah.
So we're kind of, anyway, that's my question.
Yeah, and any reference to on-site parking in the comp plan would have to be amended. You know, I don't even know, as they're doing this rulemaking came out relatively recent, like it was, they finalized it in
July 21st.
July 21st. One thing clear, we were subject to it until very recent, in the past couple of weeks. So we're on this timeline is kind of unrealistic. Frank, about it all, yeah, we would probably, if assuming it all kind of proceeds, yeah, we would have to amend our plans. Yeah, to reflect that.
Would that be the transportation section?
Yeah. Chapter 9.
I just had a question on the solar, saying, if I understand correctly, it's not really permitted much on the historic buildings, but on contemporary buildings. And I was just wondering where, Newton Square falls in that, not being historic. Like Hart was involved in the development. So I was just kind of wondering with this, with the development like that, that looks historic and had Hart involved. You know, how that affects the rules for solar.
Yeah, so in that regard, since it is a contemporary neighborhood, they would, under our code, we would allow solar to be installed on the dwelling within Newton Square. If the front facing also. Yeah. There is a potential for the community to amend their own CCNRs to reflect changes though, but yeah, our code would be specific.
On your comp plan review, that's what you're doing now, right? You're presenting the changes that staff has come up with to make. Is this the proper forum to give you input to new changes?
Sure.
Okay, well, I want to talk about fences. I don't think the city has a clear enough fence ordinance to make it clear and obvious to everybody what you can do with it. Also, I think that since that was done in 2005 or 8, whenever, there's been a lot of changes in fence material types. And I think those should be mentioned rather than have to go through this review process, spend a lot of money, and possibly find out that you're not going to get approval anyway. So I think there's a lot of improvements that could be made at that. I'm specifically talking about vinyl fencing or wood composite fencing, or even split place block walls. I know you don't have building block wall fences, and I sort of agree with that, but there are a lot of nice split face concrete walls around. And those last a long time. Wood, which has been the go-to, that's a resource that we're getting less and less of, and it's getting more and more expensive to find good wood for fences. Just look at the wood that goes into houses. That's not even the best wood pieces. So I think those other alternatives really need to be investigated and then put forth in the code so it makes it clear to everybody what you can do. So
yeah, right now the draft. Thank you for the comments. We will bring them back to the CAT. The direction right now was to kind of consistent with what the current code is and prohibit vinyl materials in the historic core area.
But again, I want to put forward that vinyl has made huge improvements. It's not a typical old vinyl fence that you see in the early 2000s. You got some pretty nice architectural vinyl fences out there that really would meet the historical or ambiance or whatever. So I think those really need to be looked at if you're going to do a real comprehensive review. At least.
Okay. Thank you.
Should I provide input in writing, or is that?
You certainly are welcome to, but we have taken your comment here as well. So, yeah, thank you.
I just want to share one thing. The comment you made, you began by talking about staff making these recommendations. Just for clarity, the CAC, the citizens group, is actually making those recommendations and working with staff in terms of a draft plan. So I just want that clarity out there. But I really appreciate your coming and sharing that. And I think there are so many ways to give input. This is one of them. There are many others.
You'll give those to the CAC, my comments to the CAC then.
Yes, absolutely.
One last thing, just because of your comment, I know I took people waiting here, but I just want to say that the state fire marshal is working on codes as well for fire safety and looking at kinds of materials for fences, looking in some way to scan some of the typical wooden fences. So all of this is very timely, and it's something we do need to look at.
I just have a question about the compatibility issue that, you know, we cannot say compatible anymore with the surrounding homes. So, Jacksonville doesn't have a lot of really modern homes. So because of this new standard where you can't say compatible, does that mean you could have a neighborhood that's outside the historic context and anyone could just build a very ultra modern house? I mean, I'm not for or against it, but I'm just putting that question out there.
There is that possibility, and there's, I would say that the draft has some specific language about roof lines, gables, and things like that. And there, you know, the way that it's written is intended to have the design standards pretty specifically outlined about the requirements for the built, for any new built dwelling unit. So in theory, someone probably could build a pretty modern new single family dwelling. And there's some areas where right now, the Westmont area is not subject to these character units currently. So we had one proposed out there with a flat roof and you know, they ordinarily didn't build that house out there. But
Well, there is one out there that's pretty modern.
yeah.
So I was just curious if you know, what's possible.
Yeah.
Just to piggyback on what Andrew was saying about the Office of the State Fire Marshal and fire codes, I know we've talked about this before, Ian. But basically, wooden fences attached to a structure of any kind, your house, you know, a deck, barn, will burn. And they will burn either from a direct fire or from embers, which cause about 90% of the fires that come in from other places. So Ashland has, and I think it's a pretty good one, and I'll go with it with you. But it has, for example, fencing attached to a building or deck within the wildland fire overlay that I say within the city shall be made of non-combustible materials within 5 feet of the connection to the structure. And then it goes into all different other kinds of things where you can do combustible fencing material. So for example, if you have a wood fence in your house, like I do in my house, it's not saying you have to take the wood fence down for an existing house. It's saying you want to put a non-combustible strip in between the house and the fence. And unfortunately, in our code, like and I think I mentioned this at the AC meeting, the Gold Terrace Heights area, the Loop and Upper Gold Terrace, all of those homes were built to be reasonably firewise, but they all had wooden fences. So the developers weren't aware of that issue. So for future, we definitely want to do something like that within the code, I think.
Yeah, and the draft, we had discussed a lot of that with the wildland interface language that we were working on, and we did the fencing before that, but that is something, you know, we discussed having that as a revision in the wildland interface section of the code, but it may be something again for the CC to revisit, have that in blanket and do all the fences.
I think you want to do it throughout because the fires are going to just happen in that wildland urban interface. It could happen anywhere. So it would be safer for the city.
Yeah, we'll bring that to the CAC as well.
For clarification, I just want to know, would hardy plank, my voice go, would hardy plank siding act as that kind of resistance between the wood fencing
Not
and the house or not?
No,
That would not be
no.
considered a barrier?
No, because if the fence starts burning, it's going to burn the siding, unfortunately. So you need something metal or
Even
something.
hardy plank that's concrete?
Yeah.
Okay, just want to clarify.
At least my understanding of how it works.
Right.
I just have a question, and it probably is covered with signs, it has to do with flags. And if there's anything in the code about flags, as far as, I assume you can't specify what they say. But as far as size goes or anything, I didn't know if there's anything in the code that has to do with. Some property.
Yeah, currently it says state and national, which again, you have to cut that state and national reference out altogether. I don't think we specifically spoke to any sort of dimensional requirements as far as flags go within the draft. So, but we'll double check that. Check on it. So, but yeah, the flag language, you can't, again, right now the code says no, it has to be, I think we specify, it has to be a US flag or something like that. Do that either, so. Yeah.
Hi, this is a question about parking, and I'm wondering about RV parking in the historic core. How long can an RV park on the street?
Oh, just generally.
No.
Yeah, so we have, it's a temporary parking requirement, which is 5 days for a vehicle that's on the right of way. So you have, I think it's 5 days or is it 7? 7? I think it's 5 for the larger. It depends on there's 2 different standards, one for a larger vehicle and one for a smaller vehicle.
So if someone has a large vehicle and parks there for 5 days and then moves it 3 feet and they park there again for 5 days. Yes.
What's up with the police? Yeah, it's making
The ordinance about moving.
Yeah, there is something written.
They have to have at least a block, I think it is.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there is, I believe there's some, but that is more, if it's parking in the right, it's less of a planning issue, more of the, you can call chief tagging on.
I have one more question about parking. So, no mandated parking anywhere. Is that pretty much it? So how will this impact, people that have, are using off-street parking for their own parking for their homes and so forth? I mean, how is that going to be regulated? It's like, so you could build a structure and you wouldn't have to provide parking, is that what this is saying?
Yeah,
And then they could flow out into off-street parking,
yes,
and, or I know they used to have to come to the council to get particular approval to reserve a parking on our public streets, but that won't probably be the case anymore.
that part maybe, that may be looked at again, I don't know, but as far as to your question about on-site, the rule is, or the requirements are that we don't mandate any more on-site parking, so in theory, someone could build a single family dwelling without any parking. It's not all that common, it does happen, we have one that I know of, but it's fairly unusual. Most folks have a vehicle and want their vehicle parked on their lot.
Well, I know next door to that one property, there's a possibility that they could build something and there would be zero off-street parking too, so
Yeah,
I'm just wondering.
well, yeah, no, so that particular area right now doesn't require on-site parking, that's in the historic core.
Okay.
If we're thinking the same property.
Yeah, we're thinking
It's not. That's in the historic core,
Yeah,
and that doesn't technically require on-site parking.
okay,
But this where they expand that, it's a similar scenario into the residential zones.
that's what I was thinking about. Okay, I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah. But yeah, someone in theory could build a multi-family, multi-units and not provide any. I mean, usually they want to get tenants in there, so like, in the context of Jacksonville, I'll leave it on the list.
Informational question, I'm Daniel Mitchell. As you move more and more parking on the streets, and you have signboards on sidewalks, where are the standards for walkability and safety of pedestrians? Peter Brett Festival is an obvious one, but there are other venues that bring a lot of traffic and a lot of people walking. And they don't mix well.
Yeah, I mean, we have the standard requirement now to have the required for the clearance to have a clear path on our sidewalks. So that's where it stands now, but beyond that, that's where we have, as far as the new sidewalk infrastructure, a lot of those are existing neighborhoods, so we won't have a lot more as far as new pathways and things, but yeah, we basically just have a 4-foot clearance right now. So again, with the parking reforms fairly new, I think a lot of things will kind of reveal themselves as we go through that. So that's another good point of consideration of just all these new modes kind of mixing together in our public space. So.
Can I address the locked gate thing?
Sure. Lost gate.
The locked gate, I had a business in downtown for years. What the fire department relies upon, if you have something that is not readily accessible for them in an emergency, get a lock box. It'll cost you about $150. Nobody can get into it. The fire department has their own key to your key that's inside of it. That can allow you to get into your residence or through your gate or whatever it is that you're locking up. But that's the best and safest way to make sure that if you're not there to open up things for them, they can get in, because otherwise they'll just bust everything down.
James, you mentioned this parking thing with the changes that are occurring with those two measures. Is that, did I read you right? Is that because our carbon footprint is not meeting the state requirement?
Yes, so generally DLCD drafted the rules because Oregon is off track to meet its emission goals by 2030.
So can we compensate for the reason that we're off track by including carbon friendly buildings or carbon friendly structures like maybe Tesla station in downtown Jacksonville to compensate for the parking?
So there are other OARs that actually require that 40% of vehicle spaces, this I believe is OAR 410, that requires that if you have 5 or more spaces required by development, that 40% of them need to be electrical vehicle charging capable. And then there's another OAR, which I think is 405, which states that if you're using sustainable building practices, like those outlined in a LEED, that you can substitute required parking spaces by having units that introduce those sustainable measures. So while there is a wide scope of trying to reduce emissions, DLCD has factored in that there's multiple avenues in doing so. And so it's hard to say you're exempt from the parking reform requirements by just going further.
Could a place like Jacksonville actually request or get a parking charging stations for?
Well, they're actually be required.
For the public? I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's one of the requirements with the later June implementation measure is that we do update the code. The parking spaces that we provide a certain amount, or the private side of provide a certain amount of charging facilities.
And then the second question is, who in the state of Oregon is going to come and verify that the city has approved a project that does or does not have the right amount of parking for the I mean, who's gonna come? Who's gonna, is there a fine involved, or, I mean, you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, exactly.
How is it gonna be regulated? I mean,
So really what DLCD has handed is a silver bullet to developers to come forward and ask to put down developments with no parking present. And if it were to go before a planning commission or a public body and they were to deny that application, a developer could go forward to the Land Use Board of Appeals and they could say, I was denied my right to OAR 440, which requires no parking within this transit corridor. My development should be approved, and then they could potentially not only get their development approved, but also go after takings in regards to their time being spent in litigation.
so you take away all the regulations of the city. That would,
Essentially, 440 rests a lot of autonomy away from cities to control their parking minimums. That's a way to view it, yeah.
Anything else? Thank you all for coming.
Yes, thank you.
When we last met on December 14th, we discussed constrained lands, which includes things like wetland, tree removal, things like that. So we will see you all in December. Happy Thanksgiving.
Gosh, it is. I got my turkey today pretty good. Oh, thank you.
Very
A
good.
little bit nervous, but.
No, you're great. You're great.
Yeah. I might be doing it, but it's actually excited about that part. Yeah.
Yeah, I like the dirt metaphor, boy, there's like the statistic and everyone, we're going to do our US.
Yeah.
We need to pave all of them. to provide enough.
Disturbing, yeah. I think something like 8 spaces every single car in the United States.
I heard the sentiment.
Yeah. Yeah, hopefully there will be.
Thank you for helping.
You know where they go next door? Yeah, absolutely. Nice meeting you.
this is really frustrating.
Not knowing all the history, it doesn't see the point. It seems to fake match.
We probably need to go over that. And it's something. So the bottom line is
I think it's what's gonna be. I like it. Yeah.
Maybe it's about. Maybe it's about, I just feel like there's such a, I feel like there's, one thing this between the higher rise, which we're doing now, and now we're talking about materials. And rules that the city has about taking out trees and replacing, and so, Mary, is there, I'm sure there is. That there is a conversation happening about being inconsistent, or maybe not being that's not what I say, but that there is a huge opportunity to bring it together. Because right now, our properties is woodland. Three parts city around us. Right behind us, protected property. Alternative property. And then our property. And so this is better for tomorrow night. This is prioritized. We never got the letter. They're like, here's what you need to do. I was like, okay. So to hear speaking of language coming from the state of saying, oh, these are materials we can use and nothing else, then there's this other. It feels very disconnected to me.
There has been discussion with Firewise. They're doing it.
I think I'll do it. Not. I mean, when part of that bill says the office of the state fair must be listed on all of that is being worked out. These conversations are happening everywhere. So but in a way, it's kind of in my view, kind of that's the state like we decided all the cities to do some money in that fire all the time. We need to have to
Fair.
how those interface with individual cities. But it is happening. I mean, it will. It's just uncomfortable now, and especially working through the process of revising the code. But I think we're doing that now, that over the horizon, we're going to be able to post coming down and looking to be proactive and try to get
Or just like we're doing right now, we're with the state with the parking, like I just see this as an ominous sort of, oh, it's all coming. So I just wanna.
confidence that we are going to, I mean, we've had our fire officer come in to say, thank
It feels that way too.
I would love to see the city adopt things like Trex, pre-painted Trex, white picketing fence, stuff like that. Speaking of one who had to have a white picket wood fence around their entire property, painting that and maintaining it is an entire nightmare. Nobody should have to be forced upon, let alone Firewise. So this is perfect timing to introduce, if it's pre-painted and it's wood texture flat, because I know where they came from with plastic stuff. That one place down off of Carriage that has that plastic fencing that's shiny and, chintzy looking. I get why nobody wants that, but to introduce things that look really like you can't tell the difference, I think that just makes sense. I agree.
I think it's gonna be a long process. I think we're in an ideal place right now, working on code and waiting for the state fire marshal. And it comes to the meeting tomorrow night and the
Yeah.
Right, but I feel optimistic, but it's like I'm saying, wait a minute, why are that code saying this? Here's the disconnect. people will listen. But you may need to respond. But come tomorrow and you can reach me through the website, council motion, or if you want to go to that. I'm committed to this. That's the best I can be. You don't want to sound like them.
Yeah.
You know, so it takes a while to get these things into our code. And I'm pretty confident that will happen.
And that's what all of this is about, is getting the voices of people forward, because it's easy when you're doing it day in and day out to miss details. You know, in your own lives, you know, you do it every day, so you forget the details. And so that's why these communications are so important.
A lot of people are independent, don't want to be told what to do. Look at a lot of standards and things that it's some kind of political climate change motivation going on. I mean, there's some resistance out there as well, that I think we all need to recognize. But I think the days of just sort of proceeding business as usual.
Well, thank you for your time tonight.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate enlightening.
Yeah, that'll really shift parking thing, because that.
Yeah, that whole parking thing is like a.
That gets me so outraged.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, especially
no way
because
how-
it's a blanket Band-Aid for the entire state, and that's based on metropolitan areas like Medford. I mean, you know, it's got to be by population, for God's sakes. Certain places like Jacksonville, historic, you know, I don't know. It just doesn't make sense.
To tell a developer he can build a 50-unit complex. And basically just shove that parking into.
Right away.
I mean, that's just outrageous.
It is insane. Because then it's gonna pit neighbor against neighbor. Yeah, because, oh, well, I was gonna park, you know, I wanna have my son over for dinner. Now there's nowhere to park. You know, I mean, things like that, that's insane. Yeah, that's crazy.
Well,
I'm sure you're tired, I think. Oh, I'm sure. I'll try to make it tomorrow. Yeah.
All right. Thank you for all your hard work. I think